On a quiet spring morning, just as the pale golden light of early day began to stretch slowly across the worn wooden floor of the kitchen, Lillian Voss stood by the sink in the house she had lived in for nearly 50 years. Her hands resting lightly against the cool edge of the counter as if she needed something steady to hold on to, though she did not yet fully understand why, because nothing around her looked different at first glance. The same porcelain teacup sat where it always did. The same lace curtain stirred gently in the open window. The same faint ticking of the old wall clock echoed through the stillness, and yet something had already shifted in a way that could not be seen, only felt. The kind of shift that settles quietly into a place long before anyone is ready to name it. And when she heard the soft, deliberate sound of the front door closing somewhere behind her, not loudly, not with frustration or anger, but with a calm finality that carried no intention of return, she did not turn immediately. Because after 47 years of marriage, after a lifetime of shared routines and familiar rhythms, a woman learns to recognize the difference between an ordinary departure and the kind that changes everything, and though she had not yet seen the envelope waiting for her in the hallway, though she had not yet read the words that would explain what had just happened, she understood in that quiet moment, with a clarity that came not from shock but from something older and deeper, that her husband was not stepping out for the morning. He was leaving in a way that did not expect to be followed, and she remained there for a long time. Longer than she would later remember, listening to the silence that followed. Because silence, she had learned, over the years, often said more than words ever could. And this silence was different. It did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy, as if it carried something waiting to be uncovered. 3 weeks later, she would sit across from a man who spoke in measured tones and careful sentences, a lawyer who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed everything had already been decided, and in that moment she would realize that what had happened that morning had not begun with the closing of a door. It had begun long before, in conversations she had not been part of, in decisions made quietly behind the structure of a life she believed was shared, and more importantly, she would begin to understand that even the most carefully arranged plans are never without flaw, that somewhere within all that quiet preparation there had been a mistake, something small enough to go unnoticed by those who believed themselves in control, but significant enough to change everything if seen clearly. Though standing there in the kitchen, she did not yet know what that mistake was, only that it existed, and that was enough. When she finally turned away from the sink and walked slowly through the house, her steps unhurried, almost deliberate, it was not because she was calm, but because everything around her demanded to be taken in differently now. The familiar had become unfamiliar in a way she could not yet explain. The hallway seemed longer than it had the day before, the air slightly heavier. And when she saw the envelope resting on the small table beneath the mirror, placed with such quiet precision that it could not be mistaken for anything accidental, she paused for a moment, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Because the neatness of it, the care in its placement, the unfamiliar handwriting of her name written in clean, distant strokes told her something important before she even opened it. This had been planned, not in anger, not in haste, but with intention, and as she picked it up and unfolded the pages inside, she read slowly. Not because the words were difficult to understand, but because each one seemed to settle into her with a weight that required time to absorb, and as the meaning became clear, as the structure of what had been done revealed itself piece by piece, she did not react in the way others might have expected. She did not cry, she did not call out, she did not collapse into the nearest chair. Instead, she stood there in stillness, letting the truth arrive fully, because somewhere inside her, in a place shaped by years of quiet endurance and careful observation, she had already begun to understand that reacting too quickly would not serve her, that whatever had been done was not meant to be undone through emotion but through something else entirely, something slower, more deliberate. And when the phone rang later that day, breaking through the quiet like a distant echo rather than an interruption, she answered without hesitation, and the voice on the other end introduced itself with a calm politeness that felt practiced rather than genuine, explaining things in a way that suggested finality, speaking of arrangements, of divisions, of decisions already set into motion. And Lillian listened without interrupting, because she had spent her entire life learning that people reveal more when they believe they are in control. And it was not the words themselves that caught her attention, it was the pauses between them, the slight hesitation before certain explanations, the careful way some details were emphasized while others were passed over too quickly, and in those small, almost invisible moments, she heard something, not clearly, not fully, but enough to know that beneath everything she was being told, there was a flaw, a quiet misstep hidden within what was, meant to appear complete, and when the call ended and she gently returned the receiver to its place, she did not move right away, she simply stood there once more, in the same house that now felt both familiar and entirely different, and understood something with a quiet certainty that did not require words, that whatever had been taken from her that morning was not the end of her story. Because somewhere within what had been done, there was a mistake, and she had spent a lifetime learning how to notice the things others overlooked, and this time, she intended to use that. The next few days passed in a way that felt both slow and strangely distant, as if time itself had lost its usual rhythm inside the walls of the house, and Lillian Voss moved through them quietly. Not as someone lost, but as someone observing, taking in small details she might once have overlooked, because when a life shifts without warning, the smallest things begin to matter in ways they never did before. The way a drawer sits slightly open, the absence of a familiar coat by the door, the silence at the breakfast table where conversation once filled the space without effort. And she noticed all of it without reacting outwardly, because she understood instinctively that what had been done to her had not been rushed. It had been arranged, built slowly over time, and anything built that way could only be understood by moving just as slowly in return. She did not call her children, though she thought of them more than once, because she was not yet ready to hear their voices shaped by second-hand explanations. She was not ready to see confusion or sympathy, or worse, the quiet acceptance that sometimes comes when people believe a situation has already been decided. And instead, she turned her attention to something far more reliable than conversation. She turned to the quiet certainty of paper, of records, of the kind of details that do not change depending on who is telling the story. And she gathered everything she could find: statements, documents, old folders that had sat untouched for years in the lower drawer of the study desk, things she had trusted without question because trust had once felt natural. Something you did without needing to prove it. She worked carefully, not in long bursts of frantic searching, but in steady, deliberate hours, sitting by the window where the light came in softly through the afternoon, reading line by line, not just for what was written, but for what was missing, for the spaces where something should have been and was not. And it did not take long before she began to feel it again, that same quiet sense. She had noticed during the phone call that something within all of this was not as complete as it was meant to appear, that there were pieces placed together neatly on the surface, while something underneath remained slightly out of alignment. She found it first in something so small it might have been ignored entirely, a reference to a property she did not recognize, mentioned only briefly, almost as an afterthought, described in language that was too vague for something that should have been clear, and she read it twice, then a third time, not because she did not understand the words, but because she was measuring them, weighing them against everything she knew, and what she knew was simple. In all their years together, in all the conversations about finances, about savings, about what they owned and what they did not, there had never been mention of anything beyond what she already understood, and yet here it was, quietly listed as if it had always existed, as if it were something she should recognize without question, and that alone told her it had not been meant for her to see. Not truly, not clearly. She did not react immediately. She did not pick up the phone or demand an explanation, because that was not how you uncovered something hidden carefully over time. You did not announce what you had seen. You allowed it to reveal itself further, and so she made a different choice, one that felt almost instinctive. She would verify what was real before she allowed herself to feel anything about it, and that decision carried her out of the house for the first time since that morning. Not in search of answers from people, but in search of answers from places that could not alter themselves to protect anyone. And she drove without urgency, without distraction, the road familiar in a way that felt grounding, until she reached the quiet building where records were kept, where transactions became permanent, and facts remained untouched by interpretation. And she stepped inside with the same calm composure she had carried through everything so far, because to anyone watching, she was just another woman with a question, another name on a list, but inside, she was already beginning to understand that what she would find would not be simple, and it would not be small, because the more carefully something is hidden, the more it has to conceal. As she sat down and began to follow the trail in the only way it could be followed, slowly, patiently, allowing each detail to lead to the next, she saw it more clearly now, not all at once, but enough to confirm what she had already begun to suspect, that there were parts of her husband's life that had existed completely separate from her own, parts that had been built quietly, without conflict, without explanation. And yet even in that quiet separation, even in the careful way it had all been arranged, there was something imperfect about it. Something that did not quite hold together under closer attention, and it was in that imperfection that her focus settled, not on what had been taken from her, but on what had been overlooked. Because it was there, she knew that everything would begin to change, though she did not yet realize how far that change would reach, or how much more there was waiting beneath the surface of what she had only just begun to uncover. In the days that followed, Lillian did not allow herself to be rushed by what she was beginning to see, because she understood now that whatever had been built without her knowledge had been built slowly, and anything built that way could not be undone in a single moment of discovery. It had to be understood piece by piece, layer by layer, the same way it had been created, and so she returned home with copies of the records she had quietly requested, placing them neatly on the table in the study where she and her husband had once sat together in the evenings, going over simple things, like bills and plans and small decisions that now seemed almost distant in their simplicity, and she sat there for a long time before beginning, not out of hesitation, but because she knew that once she started, she would not stop until she understood everything, and understanding, once reached, would change what came next in a way that could not be undone. She began again with the property she had not recognized, tracing its details with the same steady attention she had always given to things that mattered. And what she found did not come all at once. It revealed itself slowly, through small confirmations that connected to one another in quiet ways. The name attached to the ownership was not directly his, but it was close enough, familiar in structure if not in appearance, something arranged to stand slightly apart while still remaining within reach, and she followed that connection further, not with urgency, but with a calm determination that had begun to replace the uncertainty of the first few days, and as she moved from one record to another, something became clear in a way that did not require explanation. This had not been a single decision, not a sudden act, but a pattern, a series of careful steps taken over time, each one small enough to avoid notice, each one placed in a way that allowed it to blend into the life she believed they were living, and for the first time since that morning, Lillian allowed herself to feel something close to anger. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, quiet. The kind of anger that does not burn quickly, but settles deep and remains. Because what she was seeing was not just a separation, it was a deliberate rewriting of a shared life into something divided, something that had been planned long before she had been given any indication that change was coming. And yet, even within that realization, even within the growing clarity of what had been done, there was something else. Something that did not fit perfectly into the pattern she was uncovering. A detail that stood slightly apart. Not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to create a question she could not ignore, and she paused there, her hand resting lightly on the paper as her eyes moved back across the line she had already read twice, then a third time, and what she noticed was not the ownership itself, but the way it had been. Documented, the phrasing, the timing, the connection to another name that appeared only once and nowhere else, and it was that small irregularity that brought her back to the conversation she had had on the phone, to the voice that had spoken too carefully, to the slight hesitation that had seemed almost insignificant at the time, and she saw it now in a different light, not as uncertainty, but as awareness. As if the person speaking had known something was not entirely aligned, but had chosen not to address it directly, she leaned back in her chair, not out of fatigue, but to give herself space to think. And in that quiet moment, something shifted again. Not in the facts she had uncovered, but in how she understood them. Because until now she had been looking at what her husband had done, the choices he had made, the life he had quietly constructed without her. But now, she began to see something else, something that extended beyond him, beyond the decisions he believed he had controlled, and that was where her attention settled, not on the obvious, but on the overlooked, the place where plans begin to lose their precision, where details slip just enough to reveal what they were never meant to show. She did not act immediately. She did not reach for the phone or seek out confrontation. Because she knew that whatever this was, it required more than assumption, it required confirmation, and so she gathered the papers carefully, placing them back into order with the same quiet control she had maintained through everything, and she made another decision, one that would carry her beyond the house, beyond the records she had already seen, into a place where answers were not given freely, but had to be understood through careful observation. And as she stepped outside later that day, the air carrying the faint warmth of a changing season, she realized that she was no longer simply trying to understand what had been done to her. She was beginning to see where it had gone wrong, and somewhere within that mistake, somewhere within that single, overlooked detail, there was something that would not only explain everything, but change it in a way no one else had expected. Not even the man who believed he had already walked away with everything settled behind him. The following morning carried a different kind of quiet. Not the heavy stillness of confusion that had filled the house in those first days, but a steadier, more deliberate calm. The kind that comes when uncertainty begins to take shape into understanding. And Lillian rose earlier than she had in years, not out of restlessness, but because something inside her had shifted from waiting to moving. And she dressed with a care that reflected not emotion, but intention. Choosing familiar clothes, simple, unremarkable, the kind that would allow her to pass through places without drawing attention. Because she had begun to understand that what she needed now was not to be seen, but to see clearly, she carried the folder with her. Not tightly, not protectively, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that what it contained mattered. And as she drove out of town, the road unfolding ahead of her in the same slow rhythm it always had, she allowed her thoughts to settle not on what she had lost, but on what she had begun to uncover, because there was a difference now, a clear one, between those two things. And it was in that difference that her strength had quietly returned. The place she arrived at was not grand, not imposing. just a modest office tucked into a row of buildings that had likely stood there longer than most people remembered, and inside, the air carried the faint scent of paper and age, the kind of place where records were kept not for display but for permanence, and she spoke calmly to the man behind the desk, asking for access to filings connected to a name she had come to recognize, not as something important on its own, but as something that linked other things together, and when he nodded and directed her without question, she felt a quiet confirmation settle into place. Because the simplest paths often led to the most overlooked truths, she spent hours there, not rushing, not searching blindly, but following each detail where it led, allowing one piece of information to guide her to the next, and slowly, steadily, the pattern began to shift from something hidden into something visible, not completely, not yet, but enough that she could see its outline, and it was then, in the middle of that careful process, that she found it. Not with any dramatic moment, not with sudden clarity, but with the quiet certainty that comes when something finally aligns, a document that connected two things that should not have been connected so closely, a detail that seemed small on its own, but when placed beside everything else she had seen, created a question that could not be ignored. She did not react outwardly. She did not draw attention to what she had found. Instead, she sat there for a long moment, reading it again, not to confirm the words, but to understand what they meant within the larger picture. And what she saw was not just a mistake, not just a technical flaw, but something deeper, something that suggested the structure itself had not been as secure as it was meant to be, that in the process of separating one life from another, something had remained tied together in a way that could not simply be undone, and that realization changed everything, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that settled quietly into her understanding, because it meant that what had been taken from her had not been removed completely. It had been moved, shifted, rearranged, but not fully separated. She left the office without speaking more than necessary, stepping back into the afternoon light with the same calm, composure she had carried inside. But now there was something else beneath it, something steadier, something that had not been there before, and as she stood for a moment beside her car, looking out at the street as people moved past her in their own routines, unaware of anything that had changed, she understood that the story she had been handed, the one that had been presented as finished, was far from over, because somewhere within it there was a connection that had not been broken. And that connection, once understood fully, would not only explain what had happened, it would allow her to respond in a way no one had expected. She returned home that evening with a quiet sense of purpose that did not need to be spoken aloud, placing the folder back on the table in the study and sitting down in the same chair she had occupied days before, but this time she did not begin searching. Again, she did not revisit the same details, because she no longer needed to look for what was missing. She had found where the flaw existed, and now the question was not what had been done, but what she would do with it. And as she sat there in the soft, fading light of the room, the house no longer feeling as empty as it had before, she allowed herself one final moment of stillness, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that what came next would not be undone, and somewhere far from that quiet room, in a place he believed was safely beyond her reach, her husband continued his life without knowing that the one thing he had overlooked was already beginning to turn everything back toward her, slowly, quietly, but with a certainty that would not be stopped. The days that followed did not carry urgency, and that was exactly why they mattered, because Lillian understood now that anything done too quickly would only alert those who believed themselves secure, and she had no intention of giving anyone that advantage. So she moved carefully, almost quietly within her own life, maintaining the same outward routine, answering no unnecessary calls, speaking to no one about what she had found, allowing the world to continue as if nothing had changed while she worked beneath that surface, because she knew that what she held now was not just information, it was position, and position, if used correctly, did not require noise. She returned once more to the details she had uncovered, not to search again, but to confirm what she already understood, tracing the connection that had remained intact, the one link that had not been fully separated when everything else had been moved. And as she followed it carefully, allowing no assumption to go unverified, she saw it more clearly than before, not as a possibility, but as a certainty. The structure that had been created to divide their lives had left behind something it should not have, something that legally, quietly, and undeniably still connected her to what had been taken, and it was that connection, small and almost invisible to anyone who was not looking for it, that changed the balance entirely. She did not confront it directly. She did not rush to claim it. Because she understood that timing mattered as much as truth, and so she chose patience, allowing the situation to settle just enough that no one would expect movement from her, allowing those who believed everything was resolved to grow comfortable in that belief, because comfort, she knew, often led to carelessness, and carelessness was where control shifted. It was during this time, in one of those quiet afternoons where the house felt less empty and more like something waiting, that the phone rang again. The same voice, the same calm, measured tone, checking in not out of concern, but out of procedure, and Lillian answered in the same way she had before, with quiet politeness, offering nothing that could not be taken at face value, asking no questions that might reveal what she knew, and it was in that conversation, brief as it was, that she heard it again, not hesitation this time, but assumption, the belief that everything had been finalized, that nothing remained unresolved, and that belief, more than anything else, confirmed what she needed to know, because it meant the mistake had gone unnoticed, not just by her husband, but by the very people responsible for ensuring. There were no mistakes at all. When the call ended, she did not linger on it. She simply placed the receiver down and returned to her thoughts with the same steady focus she had carried through everything. Because now the path ahead was clear. Not easy, not simple, but clear. And clarity was all she had needed from the beginning. She prepared carefully. Not in a visible way, not in a way that would attract attention, but in the quiet, deliberate manner of someone who understood the value of precision, gathering what she needed, organizing it in a way that left no gaps, no uncertainties. Because what she was about to do would not rely on emotion or argument, it would rely on fact, on the one thing that could not be dismissed once presented correctly, and she knew exactly when to move. Not immediately, not impulsively, but at the moment when everything aligned just enough that the truth could no longer be overlooked. That moment came without warning, as such moments often do, not marked by anything dramatic, but by a simple readiness. A quiet understanding that waiting any longer would change nothing, and as she stepped out of the house that day, carrying nothing more than what she had prepared, she felt something she had not felt since that first morning, not uncertainty, not loss, but control, the kind that does not need to be proven because it exists in the choices one makes. And somewhere far away, in a life he believed was separate now, her husband continued forward without looking back, unaware that the structure he had trusted had already begun to shift. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that would soon make itself impossible to ignore. Because the one thing he had overlooked, the one detail he had assumed did not matter, was no longer hidden, and once brought into the light, it would not only undo what had been done, it would do so in a way that could not be reversed. Not by him, not by anyone. And as Lillian moved forward with quiet certainty, she understood that this was no longer about what she had lost. It was about what remained. And what remained, as it turned out, was enough. The final step did not arrive with drama or raised voices or any of the things people often imagine when they think of endings that turn into something else. It came quietly, in a room not much different from the one where everything had first been explained to her. Except this time, Lillian Voss did not sit as someone being told what had already been decided. She sat as someone who understood exactly what had been missed, and more importantly, what could not be undone now that it had been seen clearly. The lawyer spoke first, as he had before, with that same steady tone, that same careful structure, but there was something different beneath it this time, something less certain, because while he believed he was continuing a process that had already been completed, Lillian knew she was about to interrupt it in a way that could not simply be corrected or dismissed. And when she placed the documents in front of him, not forcefully, not with any display of emotion, but with the quiet precision that had guided her through everything up to this moment, the shift began. Small at first, almost invisible. A pause, a rereading of a single line, a second glance where there should have been none, and then the realization, not spoken immediately, but present in the way the room itself seemed to settle into a different kind of silence. What she had found, what had been overlooked in all the careful planning and quiet separation, was not just a mistake in wording or timing. It was a connection that had never been fully broken, a legal tie that still bound her to something that had been moved away from her. And because it had not been properly addressed, because it had been assumed rather than confirmed, it remained valid. And in remaining valid, it changed everything. Not dramatically, not in a way that required argument, but in a way that simply could not be ignored once placed in the open. There were no raised voices, no sudden objections, because the truth, when it is presented correctly, does not need to fight for space, it simply occupies it. And as the explanation unfolded, more careful now, more precise than before, it became clear that what had been arranged would have to be reconsidered, not entirely undone, but adjusted in a way that restored what had been improperly removed, and in that adjustment something shifted back toward her. Something that had never been fully taken in the first place. She did not look at anyone in that room with satisfaction or victory, because that was never what this had been about. It had not been about proving anything or defeating anyone. It had been about understanding what was true and allowing that truth to stand where it belonged. And when it was over, when the conversation ended and the quiet acknowledgement settled into place, she rose from her seat with the same calm composure she had carried through every step of this process, because nothing about her had changed in a way that required display. Only the situation around her had shifted, aligning itself again with something more honest than what had been presented before. Outside, the air felt different, not because the world had changed, but because she had, not in the way people often imagine change, but in a quieter, steadier way, the kind that comes from seeing clearly and choosing not to look away. And as she stood for a moment before walking to her car, she thought not about what had happened in the room she had just left, but about the morning when the door had closed behind her husband, about the silence that had followed, and how it had once felt like an ending, when in truth it had been the beginning of something else entirely. Something that required patience, attention, and the willingness to trust that even the most carefully arranged plans can falter where no one expects them to. She did not return to the house with the same weight she had carried before, because the house itself no longer held the same meaning it once had. It was no longer simply a place tied to a shared past. It had become something else. Something she could choose to keep or leave without losing herself in the process, and that choice, more than anything else, was what had been restored to her. Not just ownership of something material, but ownership of her own direction, her own future. Something that had been quietly taken without her knowing, and now returned without her needing to ask for it. She did not hear from her husband again, not in any meaningful way. And that, too, felt right, because whatever had existed between them had already been resolved in a way that did not require further words, and as time moved forward, slowly, naturally, as it always does, Lillian Voss settled into a life that no longer depended on what had once been shared, but on what remained within her, something steady, something unshaken by what had been lost. Because, in the end, it had not been loss that defined her story, but what she had chosen to do when everything appeared to be gone. And if there was one thing she understood more clearly than anything else now, it was this, that the smallest overlooked detail, the quietest mistake, can change the course of everything. Not by force, not by chance, but simply by being seen at the right moment, by the right person, and used with the kind of patience that most people no longer have. If you followed Lillian's story this far, take a moment and think about it. What would you have done in her place? Would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have waited, watched, and trusted that the truth, no matter how deeply it is hidden, always finds a way to come back into the light?